Story 1. The sticky residue of spilled beer coated the bar top, a testament to a long, busy night. I swirled the melting ice in my whiskey, the clinking sound a small counterpoint to the low hum of conversation and the mournful twang of a country song on the jukebox. It was a Tuesday, late, and the rusty nail was almost empty. Just me, the bartender polishing glasses with a grey rag, and a couple huddled in a booth at the back, their faces obscured by shadows. Perfect. The kind of quiet I craved after a day wrestling with deadlines. I took a slow sip, the burn of the whiskey a familiar comfort. Outside, the neon sign flickered, casting intermittent bursts of red light across the dusty window. The bartender, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Maggie, nodded in my direction. Another? Not yet, thanks, I replied, my voice a little rougher than I intended. She shrugged and continued polishing, the rhythmic squeak of the rag against glass a new layer added to the ambient noise. That's when I first heard it. A faint scratching, like fingernails on wood, coming from somewhere near the restrooms. I dismissed it as rats, a common problem in older buildings like this. But the scratching persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It no longer sounded like rats. It sounded deliberate. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced towards the restrooms, a dark hallway leading to a door marked with faded, peeling paint. The scratching stopped. Unease settled in my stomach, a cold knot tightening with each passing second. I took another sip of my whiskey, trying to appear nonchalant, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Maggie seemed oblivious, her attention focused on the glasses. The couple in the booth hadn't moved. They were still huddled together, their silence unnerving. I tried to catch their eye, but the shadows were too deep. The scratching started again, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Maggie, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her brow furrowed. Something wrong, hun? Do you hear that? She listened for a moment, then shook her head. Hear what? It's just the old pipes. No, it's not the pipes, I insisted, my voice rising. It's coming from the restrooms. She sighed, setting down the glass she was polishing. Look, I've worked here for 10 years. There's nothing in there but old pipes and a couple of dusty stalls. You've had a bit too much to drink, is all. I knew she was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, a primal fear gripping me with icy fingers. The scratching intensified, now accompanied by a series of heavy thuds, like something large and heavy was pacing back and forth. I'm telling you, something's in there, I said, my voice strained. I stood up, my legs shaky. Maggie rolled her eyes. Fine. Go take a look. See for yourself. She gestured towards the hallway with a dismissive wave of her hand. I hesitated, my fear battling with a strange, morbid curiosity. I didn't want to go down that hallway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to. I took a deep breath and started walking, each step echoing in the sudden silence of the bar. The scratching and thumping grew louder as I approached the restrooms. The air grew thick and heavy, the smell of stale beer replaced by a cloying, metallic scent that made my stomach churn. I reached the door and stopped, my hand hovering over the knob. I could hear whispering now, low and indistinct, coming from inside. It wasn't English, or any language I recognized. It sounded ancient, guttural, filled with a malice that chilled me to the bone. I took another deep breath and pushed the door open. The restroom was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The stalls were empty, the floors grimy. The scratching and thumping had stopped. The whispering, however, continued, now louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from the walls, from the pipes, from the very air itself. I took a tentative step inside, my eyes scanning the room. There was nothing there. Nothing I could see, anyway. But the whispering persisted, weaving around me like a shroud, tightening its grip on my sanity. Then, I saw it. A single, dark stain on the floor of the furthest stall. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was fresh. It looked like blood. The whispering intensified, rising to a crescendo of unintelligible sounds that seemed to tear at the edges of my mind. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I turned and ran, not stopping until I burst through the door and back into the bar. Maggie looked up, a bored expression on her face. "See? I told you there was nothing." Her words trailed off. The couple in the booth was gone. The jukebox was silent. The bar was empty. Except for me and Maggie. And the whispering, which was now coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very foundations of the building. Maggie's eyes widened, a flicker of fear finally registering on her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, her eyes filled with a terror that mirrored my own. The whispering grew louder, closer, suffocating. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the suffocating dread that was closing in on me, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen in place by the sheer, overwhelming terror of the unknown. The red neon sign outside flickered once more, casting a long, ominous shadow across the bar. And in that shadow, I saw something move. Something large, something dark, something inhuman. The whispering stopped. And then, everything went black. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up the next morning in my own bed, my head pounding, my memories fragmented and hazy. I tried to tell myself it was all a bad dream, a product of too much whiskey and an overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something missing. The rusty nail was still there, the same dusty windows, the same flickering neon sign. But Maggie was gone. No one had seen her since that night. And the couple in the booth? They vanished without a trace. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I still hear the whispering. Faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. A constant reminder of that night, of the terror, of the unknown. And the dark stain on the floor of the furthest stall? It was never cleaned. It's still there, waiting. A silent testament to something I can't explain, something I can't forget. Something that's still out there, waiting. Story 2. Story 2, The Brass Rail. The warm, buttery scent of popcorn usually calmed my nerves. Tonight, it did nothing. The familiar brass rail of O'Malley's, cool beneath my fingertips, offered no comfort either. I watched the condensation from my glass of iced tea drip onto the worn wooden bar top, a rhythmic, hypnotic counterpoint to the boisterous Friday night crowd. I was supposed to be meeting Sarah here, celebrating a small victory at work. She was late. 15 minutes. 20. My phone buzzed with a text. Running late. Be there soon. I sighed, a puff of air lost in the general din. O'Malley's was our regular haunt, a cozy, dimly lit Irish pub with stained glass windows and walls plastered with framed photos of local sports teams. Normally, I loved the place, the friendly banter, the familiar faces. Tonight, the laughter grated on my nerves. Every clink of glass, every burst of conversation felt amplified, intrusive. 30 minutes. My unease morphed into something sharper, a prickle of anxiety. I scanned the crowd again, a sea of faces, none of them Sarah's. The popcorn smell, once comforting, now felt cloying, almost nauseating. I ordered another iced tea, my second, maybe third. I'd lost count. The barman, a burly man with a walrus mustache named Mick, placed the glass in front of me. Sarah still not showed, he asked, his voice a low rumble. No, I managed, my voice tight. He gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. She'll be along. Give her time. But his eyes, I noticed, lingered on me a beat too long, a flicker of something unsettling in their depths. I tried to dismiss it. I was being paranoid. Sarah was probably just stuck in traffic. But the feeling persisted, a growing sense of being watched, observed. I shifted on my stool, trying to shake it off. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I glanced around again. The same faces, still laughing, talking, drinking. But now, they seemed different. Their smiles felt strained, their eyes too bright, too fixed. An hour. No Sarah. I sent another text, my fingers trembling. No reply. The noise in the pub, which had been a background hum, now pressed in on me, a cacophony of distorted sounds. The laughter sounded almost hysterical, the conversations muffled whispers that seemed to carry an undercurrent of menace. I stood up abruptly, the room tilting slightly. Bathroom, I mumbled to Mick, who was polishing glasses, his back to me. I stumbled toward the back of the pub, past booths filled with shadowy figures. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The hallway leading to the restrooms was narrow, dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. The buzzing of the light echoed in my ears, a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. As I reached for the bathroom door, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the men's room. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, like someone carefully, methodically, hitting their finger against the metal of a stall door. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The tapping continued, unwavering. I knew the men's room was empty. I had seen Mick walk out just a few minutes ago, the last patron to use it. Slowly, cautiously, I turned towards the men's room door. The tapping stopped. Silence. A thick, oppressive silence that felt heavier than the noise of the pub. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Then, a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. Help me. My blood ran cold. The whisper came from inside the men's room, a raspy, guttural sound that seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The tapping started again, louder this time, insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was joined by another sound, a low, guttural moan, emanating from beneath the closed door. Terror gripped me, paralyzing me in place. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, listening to the sounds coming from the men's room. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the door. The tapping grew faster, more frantic. The moaning intensified, rising into a chilling wail. The fluorescent light above me flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. Silence again. But this silence was different. It was a hollow, empty silence, a silence pregnant with unseen horrors. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, frozen in fear, listening to the silence. Then, slowly, cautiously, I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the pub and onto the street, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back to O'Malley's. I never saw Sarah again. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, that the stress of work, the late hour, the alcohol had played tricks on my mind. But the memory of that tapping, that whispering plea for help, the chilling silence, it stayed with me. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. Where is Sarah? What happened in the men's room? What was the source of the tapping and the whispering? The questions remain, unanswered, a chilling reminder of that terrifying night in O'Malley's. Story 3. Story 3, The Brass Rail. The dim, smoky haze of O'Malley's clung to everything like a damp shroud. The scent of stale beer and desperation hung heavy in the air. It was my usual Wednesday night refuge, a place to lose myself in the anonymity of a crowd. The worn, velvet bar stools, the chipped mugs, even the surly bartender, Marty, were comforting in their familiarity. I nursed my whiskey, watching the flickering neon sign outside reflect in the rain-slicked street. Usual, eh? Marty grunted, placing a fresh drink in front of me. I nodded, the warmth of the whiskey a welcome counterpoint to the chill seeping through the window. The bar was almost empty, just a couple of regulars hunched over their beers at the far end. Then, the bell above the door chimed. A man entered. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around him. He wore a long, dark coat, despite the mild autumn evening. He didn't speak, just walked straight to the end of the bar, settling onto a stool with a quiet grace that was unsettling. Marty didn't acknowledge him, which was unusual. I felt a prickle of unease. Something about the man felt off. He didn't order a drink. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his long fingers drumming a slow, rhythmic beat on the bar. The silence, punctuated only by the drumming, became oppressive. I took a large gulp of my whiskey, trying to ignore the growing sense of disquiet. After a while, one of the regulars, old Joe, shuffled over to the newcomer. "Evening," he mumbled. The man didn't react. Joe repeated his greeting, a little louder. Still nothing. Joe, clearly unnerved, retreated back to his corner, muttering under his breath. I shifted uncomfortably on my stool. The air felt thicker, colder. The neon sign outside flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows across the room. The man's drumming continued, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to burrow into my brain. I glanced at Marty. He was polishing glasses, his movements jerky and unnatural. He avoided my gaze. I finished my drink and signaled for another. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the glass to my lips. The whiskey tasted different, metallic, almost bitter. I looked back at the man. His head was turned, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes, black and bottomless, were fixed on me. A cold dread washed over me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. His gaze held me captive. The drumming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. The neon sign outside sputtered and died, plunging the bar into near darkness. The only light came from a single flickering bulb above the cash register, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. "Leaving so soon?" The man's voice was a low, rasping whisper, barely audible above the pounding of my heart. I shook my head, unable to speak. My throat felt constricted, as if an invisible hand was tightening around it. He smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't go." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was paralyzed, frozen in place by an overwhelming terror. He slid off his stool and started walking towards me, his movement slow and deliberate. The flickering bulb above the register went out. We were plunged into complete darkness. I heard the scrape of his shoes on the wooden floor, each step bringing him closer. The scent of something cold and metallic filled the air, a smell that made my stomach churn. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. His voice was right next to me, close to my ear. I could feel his breath on my neck, cold and damp. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for what? I didn't know. Then, silence. I opened my eyes. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see anything, not even the faintest outline of the bar. I reached out, my hand encountering empty space. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. I fumbled for my lighter, flicked it on. The small flame illuminated a circle of empty space around me. The bar was gone. Marty was gone. The man was gone. I was standing alone, in the middle of a vast, empty darkness. Where was I? The lighter flickered and died. I was alone in the darkness, the silence broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. I called out again, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. I started to walk, blindly, desperately, hoping to find something, anything, to orient myself. But there was nothing. Just the endless, suffocating darkness. And then, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic drumming, coming from somewhere deep within the darkness. It was slow, steady, hypnotic. The drumming grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by terror. The drumming was right next to me now, loud and insistent. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. And then, a voice, a low, rasping whisper, close to my ear. "We haven't finished our drink." The drumming continued, echoing in the vast emptiness. I stood there, frozen, listening to the drumming, waiting, for what? I'm still waiting. Story 4. Story 4, The Brass Rail. The laughter was loud, almost boisterous, bouncing off the worn, mahogany-paneled walls of the brass rail. A thick haze of cigarette smoke hung in the air, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains and the faded floral wallpaper. It was a Friday night, and the old bar was packed, a comforting kind of chaos after a long work week. My friend, Liam, and I sat tucked into a corner booth, nursing our beers. "Another round?" Liam asked, his voice barely audible over the din. I nodded, feeling the familiar, pleasant buzz of the alcohol warming my chest. The Brass Rail was our regular Friday haunt, a comfortable, predictable dive bar where everyone knew your name, or at least pretended to. He disappeared into the crowd towards the bar, and I leaned back against the worn leather of the booth, watching the kaleidoscope of faces. Then, the music cut out. Mid-song. A scratchy silence descended, broken only by the clinking of glasses and hushed murmurs. A cold draft snaked through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. The air, thick moments before, felt thin, strained. I glanced around, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. Everyone was frozen, mid-conversation, mid-laugh, mid-drink. Their eyes were fixed on something behind me. I slowly turned my head. Nothing. Just the darkened back corner of the bar, a space usually occupied by a dusty jukebox and a pile of forgotten coats. The jukebox was gone. So were the coats. The space was empty, but the feeling of being watched intensified, like 100 unseen eyes boring into my back. The music started again, a slow, melancholic blues number I'd never heard before. The patrons blinked, seemingly breaking free from a trance. Conversations resumed, but with a subdued, nervous energy. Liam returned, 2 beers in hand, oblivious to the sudden, strange shift in atmosphere. "What's with the long faces?" he asked, sliding into the booth. I shook my head, unsure how to explain the chilling moment that had just passed. "Just zoned out for a second," I lied, taking a long swig of my beer. It tasted metallic, like blood. As the night wore on, the unease persisted. The music continued to play unfamiliar, unsettling tunes. The laughter felt forced, the conversation stilted. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the empty corner, convinced I saw something move in the shadows. A fleeting glimpse of a dark figure, a whisper of movement. Liam, noticing my agitation, put a hand on my arm. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I don't know," I stammered. "Something feels off." He laughed, attributing it to the alcohol. But I knew it was something more. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The familiar comfort of the brass rail had been replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. Later, as we were preparing to leave, I noticed a small, ornate wooden box sitting on the bar, where the jukebox used to be. It hadn't been there before. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, I approached the bar. The bartender, a gruff man named Sal who'd worked there for decades, watched me with an unsettlingly knowing look. He didn't say a word as I reached for the box. It was surprisingly heavy, the wood smooth and cold beneath my fingers. I hesitated, a sudden premonition washing over me. "Don't," Sal finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "Don't open it." His warning sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sal just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the box. "Some things are best left undisturbed." Liam tugged at my sleeve. "Let's go," he urged, his voice tinged with fear. "This place is giving me the creeps." I nodded, my gaze lingering on the box. We left the brass rail, stepping out into the cool night air. As we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something unseen followed us out of the bar. The next day, the brass rail was gone. The building stood empty, its windows boarded up, a for lease sign hanging crookedly in the window. No one seemed to know what had happened. Sal had vanished. The other regulars, the ones I'd seen frozen in that strange, silent moment, acted like they'd never heard of the place. The wooden box, the unsettling feeling of being watched, the sudden disappearance of the bar, it all played over and over in my mind. I tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as a collective hallucination, a shared bad dream. But the fear lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. One night, weeks later, I found myself walking past the empty building. The for lease sign was gone. The boarded-up windows were open, revealing a dimly lit interior. I could hear faint music coming from inside, a slow, melancholic blues tune I recognized. The ornate wooden box sat on the windowsill, beckoning me. Story 5. Story 5, The Iron Door. The rusty screech of the jukebox's Johnny Cash song was a comforting blanket against the November chill seeping through the cracks of O'Malley's. It was a Tuesday, the kind of night where the regulars outweighed the tourists by a landslide. I knew most of their names: Jimmy the truck driver, Mrs. O'Connell with her ever-present crossword, and young Liam, the barman who poured a Guinness like a seasoned artist. I was halfway through my second pint, idly sketching on a napkin, when the door swung open, letting in a gust of wind that smelled strangely metallic. A man stepped inside, unlike anyone I'd ever seen in O'Malley's. Tall and thin, dressed in a dark, shapeless coat, he had a face that seemed carved from granite, etched with deep lines that spoke of a life lived hard. His eyes, though, were the unsettling part, pale grey, almost luminous, and unnervingly intense. They scanned the room, settling on me for a moment too long. A shiver ran down my spine. I tucked the napkin under my glass, trying to dismiss the unease. It was just a stranger, I told myself, nothing to worry about. He took a seat at the far end of the bar, his back to the wall, and ordered a whiskey. Liam served him, his usual jovial chatter replaced with an awkward silence. The atmosphere in the bar shifted subtly. Conversations hushed, laughter faded. Even Johnny Cash seemed to sing with a mournful twang. I stole glances at the stranger, but he remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. An hour crawled by. The usual Tuesday night camaraderie evaporated, replaced by a thick tension I could almost taste. Mrs. O'Connell abandoned her crossword, Jimmy stared into his beer, and Liam nervously polished glasses, avoiding the stranger's end of the bar. I felt a growing urge to leave, a prickling sensation on my skin, as if I was being watched. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from the back of the bar. Liam jumped, nearly dropping a glass. "The cellar door," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Must have swung shut." O'Malley's cellar door was heavy, made of thick iron. I'd seen it myself, it took a considerable effort to open or close. It couldn't have just swung shut. Liam, visibly unnerved, went to check. He returned a moment later, his face pale. "It's locked," he whispered, from the inside. A cold dread washed over me. The cellar had only one entrance, the iron door. No windows, no other way in or out. The stranger remained unmoved, still nursing his whiskey. He hadn't even looked up. The silence in the bar was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drip of a leaky tap. I could hear my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. The metallic smell, stronger now, seemed to be emanating from the stranger's direction. Then, the faintest of sounds, a scratching, coming from behind the cellar door. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across metal. My stomach churned. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. Mrs. O'Connell let out a whimper. Jimmy pushed his chair back, his eyes wide with terror. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was joined by another sound, a low, guttural growl, a sound that resonated deep within my bones. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my coat, pushing past Jimmy and Mrs. O'Connell, who were frozen in fear. I didn't look back. I burst through the front door of O'Malley's and stumbled into the night, the cold air stinging my face. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I huddled in the darkness, listening, waiting. The night stretched on, punctuated by the distant sirens of police cars and ambulances. I didn't dare look out the window. The next morning, the newspapers carried the story, "Mysterious Incident at O'Malley's." Liam had apparently managed to break down the cellar door. The articles were vague, filled with official no comments, and talk of an ongoing investigation. They didn't mention the stranger. They didn't mention the scratching. Weeks turned into months. O'Malley's reopened, but I never went back. The memory of the stranger, the metallic smell, the scratching behind the iron door, haunted my sleep. One rainy afternoon, I found myself walking past O'Malley's. I hesitated, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The bar was empty except for Liam, polishing glasses. He looked older, his youthful exuberance replaced by a weary resignation. I almost kept walking, but something stopped me. I pushed open the door. The familiar smell of stale beer and whiskey hung in the air, but beneath it, I detected a faint trace of that metallic scent. "Liam," I said, my voice trembling. "What happened that night?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. He glanced towards the back of the bar, towards the iron door. He shook his head slowly. "Some things," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "are best left buried." Then, he did something that chilled me to the bone. He pointed to a spot on the wall, just above the cellar door. Scratched into the paint, deep and jagged, were 3 parallel lines. I recognized them instantly. They were the same marks I had idly sketched on my napkin that night, the night the stranger walked into O'Malley's.